Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth lecture. This one is about rewriting witches. So we're going to be looking at the character of Tituba, we're going to be looking at Agnes Samuel in Weird Sister, and we're also going to be thinking about the witches in the text by Atwood and Sexton that I've also asked you to look at this week. And you can find those handouts, the Atwood poem and the Sexton poem, on the early page. So make sure you have those in front of you during the course of the lecture as well. Okay, I've put two of the book covers on the first slide of the presentation, and I want to come back to those at the end, because one of the ways I want to finish this lecture is by thinking about the ways that witches get packaged in popular fiction. So we'll come back to those, but meantime, this lecture is in part about magical realism, and it's also about postmodernism. Those will be familiar concepts to some of you, perhaps less familiar to others, especially if you haven't been studying literature exclusively throughout the course of your degree, or if you're a history student. So I'm going to talk a little bit about magical realism and postmodernism first of all, and just think about what the definitions of those are. So remember in the last lecture I talked about realism, and we looked at Henry James's definition of what a realist novel was. Well, thinking back to what realism meant to 19th century writers, that minute historical fidelity, the idea that a novel ought to reflect life as it is, or as it is seen to exist by the writer of the novel. Well then, if we have a realism, then what is a magical realism, first of all? And then what is a postmodernism? What's a postmodernist fiction? So on the first slide, I've put a definition of magical realism and one of postmodernism. So Chris Baldick's definition of magical realism is the first. And as he says, it is a kind of modern fiction in which fabulous and fantastical events, there's that word again, the Macbeth word, fantastical, are included in a narrative that otherwise maintains the reliable tone of objective, realistic report, designating a tendency of the modern novel to reach beyond the confines of realism and draw upon the energies of fable, folk tale and myth, while maintaining a strong contemporary social relevance. If you look at that last section, we can recognise the idea of realism and social relevance from the text that we've been looking at in the last few weeks. So Gaskell's work, for example, might fit into the categories of realism and social relevance, and so might Miller's as well, for that matter. But we have an additional element here, and that's the magical element. So what Baldick says about fiction drawing on the energies of fable, folk tale and myth is really important this week. The idea that they have energies is nice as well, I think. So it's not so much always, and I think I draw your attention to this week, when we talk about these texts, we're not talking always about the exact components that are brought together in some sort of scientific formula to make a magical realist text. Rather, it's about energies. It's about something a bit more ambiguous. It's about the feeling of the text. It's about whether we accept that all of it is realistic, or we think that some of it is perhaps mythical or fabulous or fantastical. So you need to think about what you think a realist text is in order to understand what a magical realist text might be. And that makes you think about what you think magic is. And here Baldick says his idea of magic in a text comes from the idea of fable, folktale and myth. So other genres which are interbred with realism to make a magical realism, if you like. It's also important what he says about the tone of the novel. So the feel is important, the tone is important. He thinks that magical realist texts maintain a tone of realism, the reliable tone of objective, realistic report, as he says here. So we kind of think we're reading a realist novel until somebody flies through the air or something similar happens. So think about that as being a good basic definition of magical realism as you go through this week. One of the questions that we might talk about, and which I'll encourage you to think about, is whether or not the texts that we look at are magical realist. You know, I'd say maybe some of them are, some of them aren't. I don't have a particularly set opinion on this. I think some critics would, but I find this a very ambiguous area. And so I'd encourage you to reflect on whether you think they are magical realist or not. Secondly, we've got a definition of postmodernism here, and this is from Theo de Haan. So what he has to say is interesting, and he expresses it in a quite postmodernist way with a list of isms on the whole. This is what he thinks postmodernism is. He says that postmodern fictions are characterised by these attributes, these traits: self-reflexiveness, metafiction, eclecticism, redundancy, multiplicity, discontinuity, intertextuality, parody, the dissolution of character and narrative instance, the erasure of boundaries, and the destabilisation of the reader. And these are just some of a long list that he gives us in this book. For self-reflexiveness, the text turns back on itself, reflects on itself, admits its own fictionality to some extent. Metafiction, similarly, a fiction building on another fiction. So perhaps we see a story in which a story is told, and then perhaps a story is told within that. Eclecticism, so the choosing of elements from lots of different genres, the bringing together of things that might not quite belong together in a conventional realist narrative, and in a modernist novel wouldn't really belong together either. Redundancy, things that don't need to be there, things that are being rolled in and played with for the sake of it. Multiplicity, that idea of redundancy, of things replicating themselves, of things mirroring each other in the text maybe. Discontinuity, abrupt breaks in the text, moments when, for example, a plot or a viewpoint is broken off from and something doesn't perhaps make sense and we're not quite sure where we are. Intertextuality, one of the themes of the module. We've come across this over and over again. I think it's a really useful way of thinking about text generally, but what de Haan says here is that intertextuality is a feature of postmodernism. Parody, so when something appears to be something and it turns out to be something else, and it turns out to be copying something else, to be simulating another kind of text, and doing so in a sort of knowing, wink-wink kind of way. The dissolution of character and narrative instance, so that characters are not realistic people. Perhaps they behave in ways which are discontinuous, to go back to an earlier term that's used here. The narrative isn't perhaps sequential, it isn't conventionally realist, it doesn't lead us in a particular direction with a particular end point. It circles back on itself, it becomes redundant, multiple, for example. There are different narratives, competing narratives perhaps. The erasure of boundaries, so things are, again, not quite what we think they are. Perhaps those are generic boundaries between different kinds of book, different kinds of genre, different kinds of story. Or perhaps the text challenges the idea of boundaries of all sorts, whether these are social, cultural, generic, or whatever. And I think the final point is really important, the destabilisation of the reader. If you feel like you don't quite know where a book is going, and you feel like it's playing tricks on you, and it's almost trying to trip you up, and that you can't quite settle into the story, and that the story doesn't, in a sense, seem to be the point of the book. It seems to be the thoughts that you think when you're reading that are the point of the book. Perhaps you reflect on yourself, you reflect on the nature of reading, and so on, and the whole thing just kind of endlessly retreats into this sort of metafictional, self-reflexive moment. Well, that's probably a good indication that you're reading something postmodernist, or you're thinking about it in a postmodernist way at any rate. So if you are destabilised as a reader, that de Haan suggests is a classic sign of postmodernism. So think about the texts we study this week. How far are they postmodernist? Do they have some or all of those characteristics? How do you think they respond to this definition? Is it a useful critical tool for thinking about them, in other words? The history of magical realism, to start with that concept, is also quite important. Magical realism and the notions of witchcraft and magic have, of course, been caught up throughout literary history. And I would argue, and some of the critics who look at magical realism in modern times would argue, that this really goes back to the period of the First World War and the 1920s. It's also not a British or American phenomenon. It starts outside of that Anglo-centric literary world and gradually invades it, gradually changes it. And I think that's quite important. It's a sort of insurgent kind of writing. It's an insurgent literary theory. It starts off as the idea of the marvellous real, something which is shockingly discontinuous and has a political point to it. And it starts off in German art criticism in the Weimar period, and it's later, as you can see from the way that it's described in that first point, primarily associated with South American fiction. So here we have a Hispanic term for it. It's meant to respond to tyrannical regimes or regimes that don't allow you to say straightforwardly, for example, in a socialist realist novel, what you think about the political situation in your country. If you write a magical text, you can often get across points that you wouldn't get across in a realist text, or at least not without being arrested or without facing serious questions about your purpose as a creative writer. So it's insurgent in those senses too. It's something that is intended to smuggle into literature ideas that might not otherwise be tolerated there. It's a subversive form. It's not fantasy or myth or folk tale, so it's not quite the sort of categories that Baldock suggested. It isn't any of those purely. So we're not dealing with the simple retelling of a folk tale. We're not dealing with a classical myth, for example. We're dealing with a sort of a queered version of that, a rewritten version of that, a version of that which is subversive and is full of self-contradiction and is full of multiplicity and so on. So they're not set in a magical otherworld. They're not a simple portal fantasy where, for example, somebody goes through a wardrobe or a station platform and emerges on the other side in a world where magic is real, where there's this entire other world available to them. So it's not about going through a portal or a gate or an entry point or something like that. We're not going into a world of gods and monsters. Instead, what the marvellous real, the magical realist, does is to smuggle that world into our world and get us to think about the nature of reality, therefore. Why are certain political positions as they are? Why is the world as it is? Is it really reasonable? Is it really what we want realism to be? Do we want the real to look like that? Or would we prefer it to be somewhat more magical, for example? Magical realism isn't usually systematic either. The magic isn't usually explained. It's not taught, it's not learned, it's not theorised. So it's not, for example, about a magical school where you learn rules. It's much more chaotic than that. And it's not about the exceptional either. It is in fact about the ordinary. It's about the ordinary, realistic, real world and the fictions about it, which are twisted, which are changed, which are moved about in order to make us think about those. So we don't have a specially gifted individual practicing magic, for example. We just have characters leading ordinary realistic lives into which the magic intrudes. As you can see, and this is the final point on this slide, it is difficult, and I think in some ways really impossible to define, because one of the things that it likes to do is to be very evasive. The magical realist likes to evade, it likes to upset the reader, it likes to destabilise the reader. And so the moment you do get a really stable definition, it seems to me it immediately wants to destabilise itself. So it's important to think about that. If you find it a slightly confusing category, you should. It is meant to be ambiguous, it is meant to be problematic. Magical realism is not an easy thing to see. Looking at its history, I think, can help us, however. On the next slide, I've suggested some early magical realisms, and I've done that with the writing of E.V. Knox, who, in the mid-1920s, wrote an article, which he subsequently published in 1929, about what he saw as a magical realism of his period. And he was right, it was magical realism. He didn't call it that yet. But later on, we would recognise the sort of fiction that he's writing about here as magical realism. And he was saying something's different in English literature, something's changed, there are these new magical texts. He said there's a recent tendency in English literature which I find a little peculiar. It is not so much a frank, open-minded tolerance of witchcraft, voodooism, magical rites, incantations and heathen sacrifice, such as might be expected from persons of intellect and culture. So, he imagines that people in his society might well be interested in these things and tolerant of them and not think they're demonic or satanic or whatever. But it's more than that, he says, it's more than that. It's a desire to plunge into these things and wallow in their mist. And he gives a parodic example, and this sounds awfully like the novel Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. It isn't on this course, but it's one of the background books that you might want to take a look at. Published in 1926, about a middle-aged woman who moves to the country and becomes a witch. And Knox's parody of this makes us think about the ways in which he imagines this early magical realism to be working. He says that the ideal storyline of one of these new kind of writings is where a woman says to her father at the breakfast table, "I thought of getting a few toads together today and buying some simples and a one-eyed cat. I've seen a heavenly little cottage down in Hertfordshire. It would be just the thing, and I want you to buy it for me, please. I shall make little wax images of people for people who want to put evil spells on their neighbours, and I shall brew hell broths and love philters and cure people's rheumatism by making ointment from mouse fat for them. I can have no end of a good time." So there's this idea that magical realism is something to do with gender, the empowerment of women. It's something to do with women embracing magic for their own ends. It's something to do with stepping out of the ordinary and into a world, not through a portal, remember, but through a different route, by simply straying over some unseen boundary into the magical, which will change your life, which will empower you, which will make new things possible for you. And that's what Knox says is washing around in the fiction of the First World War period in the 20s. The best example of it, Lolly Willows is a good example of it, Townsend Warner's novel, but I think the best example of it is Stella Benson's book Living Alone from 1919, which is full of this kind of thing. It feels unbelievably modern, this novel. I think it's magical realist in pretty much the fullest sense of the word, although it wasn't labelled as such at the time. As I've said, that term wasn't really current in English literary criticism then. But it has in it a witch who doesn't have a name, so that's interesting. You know, we have an unnamed character at the heart of this. She is very, very elusive. There's an ordinary young woman. We have that engagement of the magical, the nameless, the strange with the ordinary. The young woman, Sarah Brown, has the same initials as her author, Stella Benson. And then there's also Richard Higgins, a wizard. And Sarah and Richard have this really interesting conversation where Benson sort of thinks through some of the literary developments of her time, and she wonders about the role of magic in modern times. She's thinking about modernism, she's thinking about the First World War and the terrible consequences that it had on the societies who were involved in it across the world. And she wonders what it is that has made everything turn towards magic now. Why is it that literary genres have become more magical, as Knox said? What is it that magical realism, as it will one day be called, what can that liberate in people, in society, in her own life, herself, her as Stella Benson, her as Sarah Brown? So Sarah is talking to Richard and she says, I suppose the war was made by black magic. So this terrible evil thing that has happened, you know, in this magical world that she's in, was it down to witches? And Richard says, no, absolutely not. So the worst of this war is that it has nothing whatever to do with magic of any sort. It was made and supported by men who had forgotten magic. It is the result of the coming to an end of a spell. Haven't you noticed that a spell came to an end at the beginning of the last century, so the beginning of the Victorian period, effectively? Why, doesn't almost everyone see something lacking about the Victorian age? Something certainly died with Keats and Shelley, sighed Sarah Brown. So she's looking back to Romanticism. She's thinking that was a more magical age, you're right. Oh, well, said Richard, I don't know about books, but obviously what was wrong with the last century was that it just didn't believe in fairies. Does this century believe in fairies? If the spell came to an end, says Sarah, how is it we are so magic now? This century, says Richard, speaking about the 20th century, this century knows that it doesn't know everything. And as for spells, we have started a new spell. That's the curious part of this war. So gross and so impossible and so unmagic was its cause, that magic, which had been virtually dead, rose again to meet it. The worse a world grows, the greater will magic grow to save it. So he points really interestingly to a perception about 100 years ago now that the world needed magic, that the First World War had been a war which was based on empire, on imperial competition, on competition for markets, on militarism, on an old Victorian generation which had been brought up on these poisonous ideologies and was now expecting young people to fight a war in their service. All of those things Richard points to. as being a reason why magic is important in fiction, in culture, in people's thinking. It's important to believe in possibilities beyond that material world, the world that is the realist world, the world beyond the realist novel, if you like. And magic, he thinks, can help to liberate people. It can help them to think through new possibilities. And certainly in the course of Benson's novel, it does with her character Sarah Brown, who changes her life completely as a result of this encounter with the witch and with Richard Higgins, the wizard. So there's an early example. And again, it's not quite mapping on exactly to the text that we're looking at this week, but it's moving in the right direction. It's getting us to think about the purpose of magic in fiction and what magical realism and postmodernism can do to help us think through that place of magic in fiction. So please move on to the first exercise of this lecture and think about how far the works we're studying this week are magical realist, how far they're postmodern, and what it is that magic and these magical genres, what it is that is permitted by those. Realism inhibits certain kinds of behaviours, certain kinds of changes, certain kinds of empowerments. But what is it that magic allows? What is it that magic allows fiction to do? And then we'll move on to part 2.